Welcome. Tonight, we'll quietly explore some of the darkest true crime stories told softly, with care. These are real cases that reveal the shadows behind the everyday, but you're safe here in the calm of the night. Let the stories gently wash over you as you relax and drift into sleep. If you enjoy this journey through the mysteries of the human mind, don't forget to like and subscribe for more whispered tales. Now, settle in, breathe deep, and listen closely. Our first story tonight takes us quietly into a chilling real-life mystery, one that unfolded in the forests of Idaho, where a family's peaceful life was shattered by darkness. Let's listen closely as we uncover the tale of Joseph Edward Duncan III and the haunting events that changed lives forever. The front door stood ajar, just enough for the neighbor to notice. It was mid-afternoon on May 16, 2005, when Brenda Gruhn's landlord, a man named Joe, stepped up onto the porch of the small, battered house on White Hill Road in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. He had come to discuss overdue rent. But something was wrong. The house was still, too still. Joe pushed the door open. The stench hit first metallic and rotting, then the silence, broken only by the buzzing of flies. That's when he saw it. A dark smear on the linoleum floor, more on the doorframe. Blood and lots of it. He backed out and called the police. Deputy Richard Skiles was first on the scene. What he discovered inside shocked even a seasoned officer. There, bound and battered on the living room floor, lay the bodies of Brenda Gruhn, her boyfriend Mark McKenzie, and her 13-year-old son Slade. All three had been beaten to death violently, methodically, with what investigators would later identify as a framing hammer. The scene was pure slaughter. But something didn't add up. There were signs of another presence in the house. A bowl of cereal half-eaten. A child's toy recently moved. A second cereal bowl in the sink. That's when police realized two of Brenda's children, 8-year-old Shasta and 9-year-old Dylan, were missing. Not dead. Gone. Kidnapped. And so began one of the most horrifying manhunts in American history, and a descent into the twisted mind of a predator who stalked in silence, planned in darkness, and filmed every unspeakable act he committed. The house on White Hill Road was now cordoned off with yellow tape, its shattered calm swarming with forensics teams and grim-faced detectives. What at first looked like a domestic homicide was now something else entirely, a family annihilation with 2 children missing. That single fact changed everything. Amber alerts were issued, roadblocks were set up, officers moved door to door. But deep down, the detectives knew. Whoever had taken Shasta and Dylan had planned this. The sheer precision of the attack, and the fact that the youngest children were taken alive, pointed to someone cold, calculating, and terrifyingly patient. FBI agents joined the investigation within hours. Inside the house, there were clues, but nothing comforting. No forced entry, no obvious signs of a struggle outside the murder room. Whoever had come into the home had done so quietly, calmly. He had taken his time. And then there was the tape. Police discovered a series of plastic zip ties hidden behind the couch, along with a blood-smeared video camera left in the hallway. The camera was turned off, but its presence was chilling. It was as if the killer had documented his work. But why? That question would haunt investigators long after they identified the man behind the horror. His name wouldn't be known for weeks, but somewhere out in the vast forests between Idaho and Montana, Joseph Edward Duncan III was watching and waiting. A convicted sex offender out on bail, Duncan had driven over 10 miles to reach this home. For weeks, he had parked across from the Gruhn's house in the dead of night, watching with night vision goggles, recording their routines, learning the layout. To him, it was a game, a hunt. And Shasta and Dylan weren't children. They were prey. The morning after the crime, Helicopters swept over the timberline east of Coeur d'Alene. Patrols scoured the dense woods. Search dogs sniffed at the edges of the property. Nothing. No tire tracks. No footprints in the dirt. The killer had vanished as if he'd never been there. Inside the home, the air was heavy with decay. The coroner's van arrived just after dawn, carrying the 3 bodies out in zipped black bags. But it wasn't just death that haunted the house. It was absence. Toys still scattered in the den. A Hello Kitty backpack hung on a doorknob. A trail of muddy footprints. Too small to be adult, too fresh to be old, leading out the back door. Shasta and Dylan had walked out of that house alive. Forensics confirmed what detectives feared. The family had been subdued late at night. The killer had likely tied them up one by one, gagged them, and executed them, methodically saving the children for last. But instead of killing them, he had taken them. Why? The press ran wild with speculation. A drug-related hit, a revenge killing, a case of child trafficking. But all of it missed the truth. Joseph Duncan didn't want ransom. He didn't want to disappear forever. He wanted control. And somewhere far from the eyes of law enforcement, deep in the northern Rockies, he had set up a makeshift camp. A tent, a tarp, a cooler with soda and string cheese, rope, chains, a second video camera. To the outside world, it was wilderness. To Shasta and Dylan Groon, it became hell. For weeks, they were kept prisoner, beaten, starved, tortured. And through it all, Duncan recorded everything, treating the entire ordeal like a demented home movie. He whispered to them at night, told them he loved them, promised he'd never let them go. And all the while, the world kept searching, unaware that the devil had already built his kingdom. Shasta didn't understand where they were. The forest around them was dense and silent, soaked in shadow even in daylight. Pines towered overhead like guards, and every direction looked the same: trees, dirt, sky. There was no path, no escape. Just a small clearing filled with rot and echoes. Duncan called it camp. He said it like they were on vacation. A blue tarp flapped lazily overhead, strung between trees with cord. A tent sat in the corner, its canvas crusted with mildew. There was a plastic tub with crackers and canned food, a hunting knife buried into a log, and ropes, so many ropes. Some hung loose from the trees like nooses. Others were knotted to stakes in the ground. Everything smelled like gasoline and blood. At night, the air turned cold. Duncan would light a fire, whisper lullabies, and pet Shasta's hair while Dylan sat frozen with wide, hollow eyes. When one of them cried, Duncan would smile and record it. He filmed everything: the meals, the threats, the punishments. He called it documenting their journey. But his mask would slip. He would grow angry out of nowhere, muttering about demons, about justice, about how the government made him this way. Then he'd strike, slap, burn, hurt, and always he'd return to the camera like it was a friend. Sometimes he'd take one child away and bring them back hours later, shaken and bleeding. Other times, he would tell stories of other children, of other camps, of how he always knew what they liked. Shasta began to realize something terrible. He had done this before, many times. And worse, no one had ever stopped him. She clung to Dylan at night, their hands linked beneath a thin sleeping bag. She told him they would get out, that someone would find them, that their mom was still alive. But Dylan just stared at the fire, silent, distant. And somewhere deep inside, Shasta began to understand a chilling truth. No one was coming. It was the 3rd week. Time didn't move in the forest. The sun rose and set, but nothing changed. No rescue, no noise, no hope. Shasta couldn't cry anymore, not from exhaustion, not from pain, not even when Duncan dragged Dylan into the woods again. That day was different. He didn't come back for hours. The silence grew thick, oppressive. When the fire went out, the cold settled in. Shasta tried to stay awake, her arms wrapped tight around her knees, her face pressed into a blanket that smelled like mold and urine. And then, just past midnight, Duncan returned. Alone. His clothes were stained. His hands were shaking not with fear, but with excitement. He knelt in front of Shasta and said softly, almost sweetly, "It's justusno." Shasta didn't ask what happened to Dylan. She didn't want to know. But something inside her cracked something important. From that moment on, her body stayed still, obedient. But her mind began working, watching, planning. Duncan seemed different now, no longer tense, no longer careful. He would talk to her as if she were an adult, telling her stories about his past, the way he had been wronged, the other children who hadn't listened, and how the monster inside was finally quiet. And he made promises. "I'm gonna take you somewhere special," he whispered. "We're gonna be a family. Just us." He showed her the camera, played back the videos like home movies. He asked her to smile, to wave, to say she was happy. She did, because she understood. The only way out of this was through his mind. She had to pretend, to manipulate him. She would survive. But Duncan, he believed it. The act, the smiles, the fear beneath her voice. And as his delusions grew, so did his arrogance. He stopped hiding, and one day, he said 5 words that chilled Shasta to the bone. Let's go back to town. July 20, 2005. Just before 2:00 a.m., the Denny's off 4th Street in Coeur d'Alene was nearly empty. Just a pair of late-night waitresses, a trucker dozing in a booth, and the flicker of overhead fluorescents. The air smelled of burnt coffee and grease. Then the door opened, and in walked a man and a little girl. She looked tired. Her hair was dirty, her clothes wrinkled and oversized, as if they hadn't been washed in weeks. She clutched a small pink backpack in her lap. Her eyes never stopped scanning the room. The man was tall, wiry, with dark hair and a too wide smile. He looked off, out of place, like someone trying too hard to seem normal. He ordered pancakes for both of them and chatted casually with the waitress. Shasta groaned, sat across from her captor, eating slowly, stealing glances toward the counter. She didn't speak, but inside her mind screamed. This was her chance, her first contact with the outside world, and she took it. When the waitress walked by again, Shasta whispered, "I'm Shasta." The woman froze, eyes widened. The name was everywhere. Amber alerts, billboards, news broadcasts. For over 6 weeks, all of America had been looking for this girl, the kidnapped child whose family had been murdered in cold blood. The waitress quietly stepped away and called the police. Within minutes, the parking lot was flooded with cruisers. Officers surrounded the building with guns drawn. The man didn't resist. As they handcuffed him, he smiled calmly, like someone who had just finished a long trip. He turned to one of the deputies and said, "You're gonna want to talk to me." He gave his name, Joseph Edward Duncan III. And as police rushed Shasta to safety, unaware that her brother Dylan was already gone, they began unraveling the depths of what Duncan had done not just to the grown family, but to many others before them. The nightmare was far from over. Joseph Edward Duncan III was not a stranger to law enforcement. Long before the Groene tragedy, his name was whispered in courtrooms and prison yards across the country. Born in 1963 in Tacoma, Washington, Duncan's childhood was marred by neglect and abuse. Raised in a broken home, he He grew up isolated, angry, and deeply disturbed. Early on, he developed a dark obsession with children, a secret that would soon destroy many lives. His criminal record began in his teens, escalating from petty theft to sexual offenses. Prison became a revolving door, but instead of reforming, Duncan's hatred deepened. Psychiatrists labeled him a dangerous psychopath, someone incapable of empathy. Yet, somehow, he was released again and again. In 1996, he was convicted of kidnapping and sexual assault of 2 boys in Idaho. Sentenced to over 20 years, Duncan managed to get out on bail, awaiting appeal, the same bail that allowed him to travel to Coeur d'Alene and commit the Groon murders. Investigators learned chilling details from his past. Secret videos, hidden trophies, years of tormenting victims in silence. Duncan's mind was a labyrinth of cruelty. He planned the Groon attack, meticulously stalking the family for weeks, gathering supplies, studying their habits. To him, they weren't people. They were objects, means to an end. And now, with the law finally closing in, Duncan's true nightmare was just beginning. With Duncan in custody, the court became the next battlefield. Prosecutors prepared a mountain of evidence, chilling videotapes, physical proof, and harrowing survivor testimonies. The nation watched as the horrors of White Hill Road were laid bare, one brutal detail at a time. Shasta, now safe but forever scarred, testified with quiet strength, recounting the unspeakable torment. Her words were met with silence except for Duncan's cold, unreadable stare. His defense team tried to paint a picture of mental illness, pleading for leniency. But the jury saw through the facade. Duncan's crimes were not acts of madness, but calculated evil. The trial exposed dark truths about the criminal justice system's failures, how a monster like Duncan had slipped through the cracks, free to strike again. It raised uncomfortable questions about bail, parole, and the protection of the innocent. As the verdict approached, tension gripped the courtroom. In the end, Joseph Duncan was sentenced to death, the first in Idaho in decades. But the shadows of his crimes would linger, haunting those left behind. The courtroom emptied, but the echoes of that dark summer never faded. Shasta Groween, once a frightened child, began the long journey toward healing. But scars ran deep, physical, emotional, and psychological. The memories of those weeks in the forest haunted her dreams. The twisted smile of Joseph Duncan was etched forever into her mind. The community of Coeur d'Alene grappled with disbelief. How could such evil have walked among them undetected? How could a convicted predator be free to commit such horrors? Vigils were held, counseling centers opened, parents held their children tighter. But questions lingered. Could this nightmare have been prevented? Was justice enough? Meanwhile, Joseph Duncan awaited his fate in a sterile death row cell, surrounded by cold concrete and silence. Some nights, he reportedly muttered to himself, replaying his crimes like a cruel director editing a film. The Groen family's tragedy became a grim Lasona warning etched into the annals of American true crime. It exposed the darkest corners of human depravity and the fragile line between safety and nightmare. And though Shasta and Dylan survived, the shadows of White Hill Road stretched far beyond that Idaho forest. The trial's conclusion did not bring peace. It sparked fury and a call for justice system reform. Families across America demanded answers. How could Joseph Duncan, with his long rap sheet and history of violence, be out on bail? Lawmakers in Idaho pushed for tougher restrictions on bail and parole for sex offenders. New laws mandated stricter monitoring and harsher penalties. But for many, these changes felt like too little, too late. In Coeur d'Alene, the community sought healing in togetherness. Support groups for survivors of violence flourished. while memorials for the Gruen family stood as somber reminders of the cost of complacency. Shasta Gruen, resilient beyond belief, began speaking publicly about her experience, turning her trauma into advocacy. Her courage inspired others to break their silence. But despite the hope, the scars remained. The woods near White Hill Road grew quiet again, but the nightmare lived on in whispered memories and in every child's fear of the dark. Joseph Duncan's name became synonymous with Horrorin, eternal warning of the evil lurking behind the most ordinary doors. While Shasta survived and Joseph Duncan faced justice, Dylan's fate remained a chilling mystery. Despite exhaustive searches, no trace of the young boy was ever found. Investigators pieced together a grim theory. Duncan, in a final act of cruelty, had killed Dylan somewhere deep in the wilderness, far from roads, far from rescue. Rumors swirled about secret burial sites, abandoned cabins, or remote caves. But every search returned empty, only raising more questions and despair. For years, Dylan's disappearance haunted the case, a wound that would never fully heal for Shasta, her family, and the community. It was a reminder that some darkness cannot be undone, that evil sometimes claims its victims forever. Survivors of unspeakable horrors often find themselves trapped not just by memories, but by silence. Shasta Gruen's life after rescue was a fragile balancing act between normalcy and nightmare. At school, she faced whispers and pitying stares. At home, the walls seemed to close in with memories of the forest camp. Every night brought nightmares of Joseph Duncan's voice, the crackle of the campfire, and the shadowed woods where her brother vanished. Therapy helped, but healing was slow and uneven. Trust was fragile. Even family felt distant, haunted by their own grief. Shasta's brave public appearances were both catharsis and torment. Speaking out meant revisiting trauma, yet it gave her purpose, a way to fight back against the darkness that tried to swallow her whole. Her story became a beacon for other survivors, proof that even in the deepest darkness, a flicker of light remains. But some nights, in the quiet moments, the shadows crept back, and she remembered. Behind the headlines and courtroom drama lay the grueling work of law enforcement officers determined to piece together Duncan's trail of terror. Detectives from multiple agencies pooled resources: FBI, local sheriffs, and state police, digging through Duncan's past, mapping his movements, and chasing every lead. But the case was a labyrinth of missed chances and bureaucratic gridlock. Duncan's repeated releases and bail approvals sparked outrage. Officers, frustrated by paperwork and jurisdictional red tape, struggled to understand how such a dangerous man remained free. Evidence collected from the Gruen property was painstakingly analyzed: digital forensics, fingerprints, fibers. But the trail was cold in many places, obscured by time and Duncan's careful planning. Officers haunted by the case carried its weight home every day. The search for Dylan grew desperate but ultimately futile. The investigation exposed cracks in the system, failures in monitoring sex offenders, communication gaps between states, and a lack of urgency in tracking violent criminals. It was a stark reminder: evil can thrive not just in the shadows, but in the failings of the institutions meant to stop it. Joseph Duncan's mind was a dark labyrinth, twisted by years of abuse, obsession, and hatred. Psychologists who evaluated him described a man utterly devoid of empathy, whose charm masked a cold, calculating predator. His diaries and recorded confessions revealed disturbing details, fantasies of control, domination, and destruction. Duncan believed himself a force of justice, punishing those he deemed corrupt or weak. In his warped logic, his victims were merely objects, tools in a perverse game. Duncan's childhood was a crucible of trauma, neglect, cruelty, and isolation. Experts argued that his early environment seeded the darkness. but none could excuse the horror he wrought. His crimes were marked by meticulous planning and chilling calm. He stalked families, learned their routines, and prepared for weeks. His camps were prisons of terror, where he played God over terrified children. Interviews with Duncan were unnerving. He spoke without remorse, his voice monotone, sometimes eerily cheerful when describing violence. He seemed fascinated by his own evil as if it were a puzzle he alone understood. Understanding Duncan's mind was crucial for law enforcement and psychologists alike, but it also served as a grim reminder. Evil wears a human face and often hides in plain sight. Despite the horror, the story of the Groan family is not just one of darkness, it's also a testament to the unbreakable human spirit. Shasta Gruen, the young survivor, became a symbol of courage and hope. Slowly, she reclaimed her life, supported by a community that refused to forget or let her suffer in silence. Counseling programs, victim advocacy groups, and local volunteers rallied around survivors of abuse and violence, spurred by the Gruen tragedy. Neighbors and strangers alike came together to form networks of protection, determined to prevent such horrors from happening again. Schools implemented programs teaching children about safety and awareness, empowering them to speak out. Shasta's voice echoed beyond Idaho. She spoke at conferences and appeared in documentaries, breaking the silence surrounding abuse and kidnapping. Her message was clear: no child should suffer alone. The community memorialized the Gruen family, not just as victims, but as reminders that evil can be fought and sometimes defeated. Yet the scars remain. Healing is a lifelong journey, but through resilience, love, and solidarity, survivors like Shasta prove that even in the darkest nights, dawn can break. The shockwaves from Joseph Duncan's crimes reached far beyond Coeur d'Alene, shaking the foundations of the American justice system. Lawmakers faced mounting pressure to close dangerous loopholes that allowed repeat offenders like Duncan to slip through the cracks. New legislation swept across Idaho and neighboring states, imposing stricter bail restrictions for violent sex offenders and enhancing interagency communication. Programs were established to improve monitoring of convicted predators, utilizing GPS tracking and regular psychological evaluations. Victim protection laws were strengthened, providing survivors greater resources and support. Yet, despite reforms, many questioned whether the system could ever fully prevent such horrors. Critics pointed to systemic flaws: overcrowded prisons, limited mental health resources, and bureaucratic inertia that allowed monsters to re-emerge. Still, Duncan's case became a turning point, a grim catalyst for change. It forced communities and governments to confront uncomfortable truths about safety, justice, and accountability. For Shasta and countless survivors, these reforms offered a sliver of hope, a promise that the nightmare they endured would not be in vain. Joseph Edward Duncan III spent his final years confined to a sterile death row cell, isolated from the world he once terrorized. The man who had haunted the nightmares of so many awaited the ultimate judgment. In the cold solitude, Duncan reportedly showed no remorse. Some guards said he muttered cryptic phrases. Others claimed he stared blankly for hours, trapped in his own twisted mind. Appeals and legal battles stretched on for years, dragging out a final reckoning that seemed to prolong the agony for victims and families. But justice, however delayed, remained inevitable. On July 28, 2021, Joseph Duncan was found dead in his cell in apparent suicide. The darkness that had consumed him finally swallowed him whole. For many, his death offered a somber closure, but it also reopened wounds. The memories of his crimes and the lives destroyed refused to fade. Joseph Duncan's legacy is a chilling reminder of the evil humans are capable of and the urgent need for vigilance, justice, and compassion. And as Joseph Duncan's story comes to an end, we drift off onto our next true crime story. A dark corner of truth that lies hidden beneath the surface of ordinary lives. As you listen, let the calm in your room wrap around you like a blanket. Let the black screen draw your attention inward. But behind your closed eyes, allow this tale to gently unfold. Because this is no fiction. This story is real. And once you hear it, you may never forget it. Tonight we travel to the dry, isolated heat of Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. A town with a name that sounds like a riddle, but would soon become home to a far more terrifying puzzle. A man lived there. A man who built a dungeon. A man who called it the Toy Box. And inside that chamber, hidden in a simple white trailer, he created hell on earth. It was March 2020, 1999. The air was dry and still in the tiny town of Elephant Butte, New Mexico, just 15 minutes outside Truth or Consequences. On that day, a woman named Cynthia Vigil, a 22-year-old sex worker, stepped into what she thought would be a routine job. The client was older, calm, and had a soft, polite voice. He said his name was Dave. He took her to a double-wide white trailer parked behind a high fence, just off a dirt road. From the outside, it looked ordinary, rusted slightly with age, tucked beside a shed and a few broken-down vehicles. There was nothing remarkable about it. But as soon as Cynthia stepped inside, her world collapsed. She was attacked, handcuffed, collared, chained. And then the man pressed a button on a cassette player. A voice began to speak. It was his voice. Calm, matter-of-fact, almost surgical in its detachment. Over the speakers, the man laid out exactly what would happen to her in the coming hours and days. Cynthia was about to become the latest prisoner inside what David Parker Ray called his playroom. The voice on the cassette player crackled faintly as it began, eerily calm, as if reading from a set of instructions. The man's voice was unmistakably David Parker Ray's. "Hello there, B. H. You're probably wondering why you're here." So began the 45-minute recorded message he had made for his victims, pre-written, rehearsed, and played at the beginning of every new captivity. David Parker Ray didn't scream. He didn't threaten. He explained, methodically, precisely. The recording detailed everything that was about to happen to Cynthia Vigil, the types of restraints he would use, the medical instruments he would insert, the psychological games he planned to play. He outlined it all like a twisted professor in a lecture hall, lecturing on the anatomy of torture. She was told she would be held for days, maybe weeks, that she would be raped, drugged, and tormented until her mind broke. And then, if she was lucky, she'd be released with no memory of what had happened. That was the goal. To erase the pain by removing the past. David didn't work alone either. His girlfriend, Cindy Hendy, a woman with a dark past and a thirst for control, helped lure the victims in. Together, they became monsters hiding in plain sight. As Cynthia lay chained in the trailer, trembling in fear, the horrors began just as described. The room was lined with tools whips, gags, surgical scissors, syringes, chains, clamps, and worse. On the walls were diagrams of female anatomy, notes, and codes. Everything in the toy box was labeled, categorized, and prepared. But Cynthia Vigil was not like the others. She would fight, and she would escape. Cynthia Vigil had already endured hours of torment. Her wrists were bruised and raw from the handcuffs. A leather collar was fastened tightly around her neck, connected to a metal chain that anchored her to a beam in the trailer. But somewhere beneath the drug-induced haze and rising panic, her mind remained clear, focused, burning with one thought: I will not die here. David Parker Ray had left the trailer briefly that afternoon. Cindy Hendy was still inside, cleaning up the aftermath of their sick ritual. For one moment, she got careless. She left the keys to the cuffs on a nearby table. Cynthia waited. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She listened. And when Hendy walked away for just a second, she lunged. A struggle erupted. Cynthia knocked over a lamp. Cindy Hendy screamed, grabbing a nearby ice pick and slashing wildly at her. But Cynthia, driven by pure survival, wrestled the weapon away. With blood dripping down her hands, she unlocked the handcuffs. She tore open the trailer door and bolted into the blazing New Mexico sun completely naked, except for the chain and collar still hanging from her neck. She ran down the dirt road screaming, her feet bloodied by sharp rocks and broken glass. She pounded on the door of the first house she saw. The homeowner, startled by the sight, opened the door to find a terrified woman covered in wounds, shaking and incoherent. "They're going to kill me," she cried. "He's going to kill me." The man let her in. He called the police, and the nightmare finally began to unravel. What law enforcement would find inside that trailer was a descent into hell. When officers arrived at the dusty property behind 513 Bass Road, they weren't sure what to expect. The call had sounded like a domestic abuse case, horrifying, yes, but not out of the ordinary. That perception shattered the moment they stepped inside the white trailer. The door creaked open. What greeted them inside would haunt even the most seasoned detectives for the rest of their lives. The toy box, as David Parker Ray called it, was a specially constructed soundproof torture chamber. It was meticulous, organized, designed not for chaos, but for efficiency. The trailer's interior looked like a cross between a medieval dungeon and a surgical suite. There were chains bolted to the ceiling. Mirrors were mounted above a gynecological exam table in the center of the room so the victims could see everything being done to them. Racks along the walls held whips, straps, clamps, saws, surgical scissors, gags, dildos of various sizes, and electrified instruments. There was a wooden contraption labeled the fender bender. Its purpose? To immobilize victims in the most degrading and painful positions possible. A homemade electrical generator powered wires that could be attached to sensitive parts of the body. Nearby sat a video camera, already queued up to blank tapes. And then they found the tape recorder, the one Cynthia had heard on her first day in captivity. The now infamous intro tape. Detectives played it, and the calm, matter-of-fact voice of David Parker Ray filled the room. "You are here against your will. You probably think you're going to be raped. And you're right. Our primary interest is in what you've got between your legs." For 45 minutes, the voice detailed the agony he planned to inflict. He described drugs he would use to erase memory. He explained how to train a victim into compliance like a pet. It wasn't just disturbing, it was systematic evil. The FBI was called in. What they discovered would only deepen the horror. As federal agents began their sweep of David Parker Ray's trailer and property, a sickening realization began to crystallize. This was not his first victim. In fact, it likely wasn't even his 10th. Investigators unearthed hundreds of pieces of evidence, drawings, photographs, videotapes, diaries. There were meticulous records, notes written in Ray's tidy handwriting describing women by name, height, appearance, and how they responded to various methods of torture. Some tapes showed women tied down, screaming, pleading faces contorted in pain. Most were never identified. The quality was poor, the camera angles deliberate, and the lighting washed out. But the terror on their faces was unmistakable. They had been real, and many were now gone. Ray kept jewelry, clothing, and shoes from women who had vanished. A chilling collection of trophies. Then came the truly disturbing clues. In a nearby lake, Elephant Butte Reservoir, Ray had allegedly dumped several bodies, weighted down with cinder blocks. His own daughter, Glenda Jessie Ray, later testified that she had seen her father dispose of at least one corpse. No bodies were ever recovered. Cadaver dogs picked up scents in multiple locations across the property, but the terrain was vast, rocky, and dry. Perfect for hiding secrets. The case had gone from an isolated escape to a serial predator's den. Still, Ray denied it all. He claimed Cynthia Vigil was a liar, that she'd agreed to consensual BDSM. But the evidence spoke louder, and then another survivor came forward, and another. Women who had vanished suddenly reappeared in the investigation. Each one had a similar story. Drugged, chained, forced to listen to the tape, assaulted for days, then released, confused, half-mad, and told it had all been a dream. Ray's twisted genius wasn't just cruelty, it was control. As the investigation deepened, the horror widened. David Parker Ray was no lone madman operating in secret. He had help. First, there was Cindy Hendy, his live-in girlfriend and willing accomplice. When interrogated, she didn't deny the charges. Instead, she talked. She described in graphic detail how she and Ray worked together to select, drug, restrain, and torture women. She confessed to luring victims, preparing equipment, even cleaning up blood. She admitted she enjoyed it. She also revealed that Ray believed in training, women, breaking them down psychologically to make them compliant slaves. Some victims, she claimed, had been held for weeks, subjected to repeated abuse, only to be released later with no memory. Thanks to Ray's mix of sodium pentothal and phenobarbital drugs, he claimed could erase time itself. Then came a bombshell. Ray's own daughter, Glenda Jessie Ray, had also been involved. She allegedly helped her father abduct women. In one known instance, she lured a young woman, Kelly Garrett, under the false promise of a party. Kelly vanished. Her family believed she had run away. But years later, Kelly was found and her story was chilling. She remembered being taken to the trailer, chained, and tortured for 2 days. She managed to escape during transport, wandering the desert until she collapsed near a highway. Her memory of what happened was fragmented, confused just like Ray intended. Her claims were dismissed for years, until they matched Cynthia Vigil's story almost exactly. The FBI now faced the horrifying reality that multiple people had helped Ray, and even worse, that dozens of victims had likely been captured and discarded like garbage. How many had been killed? No one could say. But the cold efficiency of the operation and the number of accomplices suggested something far more sinister than a single man's depravity. It was a system, a hidden web of torment, concealed in the desert. The legal system had never faced a case quite like this. By the time the trial against David Parker Ray began in 2000, investigators had uncovered at least 14 known potential victims, multiple survivor testimonies, audio and video recordings, and the trailer itself, a physical embodiment of evil. Yet, despite this staggering mountain of evidence, prosecutors faced an uphill battle. There were no bodies. Without physical remains, murder charges were nearly impossible to pursue. Ray had been so methodical, so clean in his disposal, that not a single corpse had ever been found. So instead, the charges focused on abduction, rape, assault, and conspiracy. The case hinged primarily on 3 key survivors. Cynthia Vigil, the woman who escaped and triggered the investigation. Kelly Garrett, abducted in 1996 and gaslighted into believing she'd imagined the trauma. Angie Montano, another victim who had escaped after 3 days of captivity. Each woman gave harrowing testimony, describing eerily similar patterns. The tape, the table, the tools, the mirror, and the man who watched them with cold, dead eyes, as if they weren't even human. Ray showed no remorse. In court, he sat motionless, calm. A gray, aging man in plain clothes, smiling occasionally. Not sadistic, not angry, just mildly amused, like someone watching an old movie he'd already seen. The media dubbed him the Toy Box Killer, though he was never convicted of a single murder. That perhaps was the greatest tragedy. Still, in 2001, he was sentenced to 224 years in prison for numerous charges of sexual torture, kidnapping, and conspiracy. Cindy Hendy, in exchange for testifying, received 36 years. Jessie Ray was given 2.5 years for her role in a single kidnapping. It wasn't justice, but it was something. However, the story doesn't end there. On May 28, 2002, just hours after being transferred to prison, David Parker Ray died of a heart attack. He never served a single full day behind bars. He never confessed. He took the number of victims and the locations of their bedisto his grave. When David Parker Ray died in his cell at age 62, the town of Truth or Consequences, New Mexico exhaled, but the air remained heavy. His death was too easy, too quiet for the decades of horror he had inflicted. There was no final confession, no names, no closure, and for law enforcement, his passing was a disaster. There were hundreds of unanswered questions. Photographs of unidentified women, some smiling, others gagged and bleeding, remained pinned on investigation boards. Audio tapes that recorded hours of screaming. Torture logs marked with dates, initials, and symbols never fully deciphered. The FBI believed Ray may have murdered more than 60 women. Many had been transients, runaways, sex workers, women whose disappearances barely made the news. Without bodies, they were classified as missing not murdered. Despite exhaustive searches, not a single victim's remains were ever recovered from Elephant Butte Lake or the surrounding desert. Ray had always bragged that he could make someone disappear without a trace. And he did. Even more chilling were the rumors that others had participated, unnamed friends, possible clients, silent witnesses. There were whispers of underground rings, of tapes that had been sold, of parties held in the trailer before Cynthia's escape. It was hard to prove, but it was harder to forget. The white trailer, the toy box, was eventually dismantled and stored by the FBI. A few years later, it was quietly destroyed, erased from existence. But those who stepped inside it never stopped seeing it. Retired FBI agents, local officers, journalists, all of them spoke of the same feeling, that something evil had lived there. Not just a man, something deeper, something beyond cruelty, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the screams. To this day, locals in Truth or Consequences avoid the old property. The dirt road behind 513 Bass Road remains dry, cracked, and empty. But some say, on certain nights, when the desert wind shifts, you can hear something faint. Not the wind, not the coyotes, but a woman's voice screaming from underground. Some monsters wear masks. Others smile and speak softly. David Parker Ray didn't need the dark to hide. He built it with his own hands and locked others inside it. The truth he left behind may never be fully uncovered, but the silence of those still missing will always echo through the desert. Now take a breath And as we step away from the horror that unfolded behind those trailer walls, we open the door to another story. One buried in shadows and stitched with secrets. The city of Seattle, nestled among towering evergreens and shrouded by near-constant rain, is a place of quiet beauty and secrets. Between 1982 and 1998, the shadows of this city concealed a terrifying truth. A predator who prowled the rain-slicked streets, selecting victims in the darkest hours, leaving behind bodies that would haunt the region for decades. He was dubbed the Green River Killer, a name that would become synonymous with horror and heartbreak. His victims were mostly young women runaways, sex workers, and vulnerable teenagers, women the world often overlooked. They vanished without trace, only to be found later in remote riverbeds, stripped, beaten, and murdered. What made this killer terrifying wasn't just his brutality, but his invisibility. He moved quietly, blending seamlessly into everyday life, evading suspicion for years. For a long time, the police had no idea who he was. No clear suspect. No pattern anyone could grasp. The community was gripped by fear, the river that should have been a place of calm becoming a sinister symbol of death. But slowly, a picture began to emerge. A man who was patient, methodical, cold. A man who would stop at nothing to satisfy his dark urges. The first body was found in July 1980, twonaked, beaten, and discarded near the Green River outside Seattle. It was a grim discovery that would soon become a horrifying pattern. Over the next few years, dozens more victims were found, all bearing the same brutal signs of violence: strangulation, blunt force trauma, and chillingly, the same attempt to erase their identities by removing their clothing. The killer's method was both cruel and calculated, choosing young women who lived on the margins of society. Many involved in prostitution or struggling with addiction. They were often last seen hitchhiking or walking alone at night. Despite the growing number of victims, the police faced immense challenges. Many victims were initially reported as runaways, and the fragmented nature of their lives made it difficult to connect the disappearances. Mistrust and stigma surrounded the victims, and that slowed the urgency of the investigation. The community lived under a cloud of fear and suspicion. Parents warned their children, and women walked in groups or avoided going out alone. The killer was patient. He studied his prey. He learned the rhythms of the city and slipped through its cracks like a ghost. But as the bodies mounted, the pressure on law enforcement grew. New task forces were created. Tips poured in. Suspects were questioned and released. The killer remained just out of reach. And all the while, the rain kept falling, washing away footprints but not the horror. Years passed, and the Green River Killer continued his reign of terror. His victims found in isolated locations, often near the riverbanks, their lives cruelly cut short. The case grew cold many times, frustrating investigators and terrifying the public. But behind the scenes, forensic science was quietly evolving. In the late 1980s, investigators began to employ DNA analysis, a new tool that would change the course of the investigation forever. Samples collected from victims and the crime scenes were meticulously analyzed, slowly painting a clearer picture of the killer. But without a suspect's DNA to match, the puzzle remained incomplete. A breakthrough came in the early 2000s. Gary Ridgway, a seemingly average man and longtime suspect, had been under police scrutiny for years. A truck painter by trade, he lived quietly with his family, appearing normal and unremarkable. But when detectives collected DNA from Ridgway under a pretense, the evidence was undeniable. The DNA matched samples from multiple victims. Confronted with overwhelming proof, Ridgway confessed to 49 murders, though some experts believe the true number could be higher. He spoke calmly and coldly about his crimes, admitting to strangling women and dumping their bodies near the Green River, often returning to the sites to relive the moments. The community was stunned. The monster had lived among them all along. Gary Ridgway's confession sent shockwaves through the Pacific Northwest. A man who had blended so seamlessly into everyday life now revealed himself as one of America's most prolific serial killers. His chilling admissions were methodical, almost clinical. He described how he would approach women, often convincing them to get into his truck with promises of work or kindness, only to lead them to their deaths. His preferred method was strangulation, a silent, intimate act that mirrored his own twisted need for control. Ridgway confessed to murdering at least 49 women, but he hinted that the true count might be closer to 71. Despite pleas from families and investigators to reveal all his secrets, he chose to withhold some information, leaving parts of the mystery forever unsolved. The impact on the families was devastating. For years, they had lived in uncertainty, clinging to hope that their loved ones might still be alive. The truth was both a relief and a new kind of pain confirmation that their daughters, sisters, and friends had suffered unimaginable horrors. The community struggled to heal from the trauma. Seattle and its surrounding areas became symbols of both tragedy and resilience. New programs were established to support victims' families and educate the public on violence prevention. Gary Ridgway was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence meant to ensure he would never harm another soul. Yet, even behind bars, the shadows of his crimes linger, haunting the memories of those who survived and the echoes of those who did not. The Green River Killer case left an indelible mark on law enforcement, forensic science, and the communities forever changed by his actions. The investigation spanned nearly 2 decades, one of the longest and most complex in American history. It pushed the boundaries of forensic technology, particularly DNA analysis, setting new standards for future cases. Detectives learned hard lessons about the importance of persistence and the need to listen carefully to the voices of victims, often overlooked by society. The case also reshaped how law enforcement approaches serial crimes, emphasizing victim advocacy, interagency cooperation, and the crucial role of behavioral profiling. Families of victims, though forever scarred, became advocates for change, helping to establish support networks and raising awareness about missing and exploited persons. While Gary Ridgway remains imprisoned, the story of his victims lives on. Memorials stand as solemn reminders that behind every statistic was a person with dreams, hopes, and loved ones. The Green River Killer's reign of terror may have ended, but his story serves as a chilling warning. Evil often hides in plain sight beneath the calmest surfaces. As we close this chapter, remember there is darkness in the world. But in the quiet resilience of communities and the relentless pursuit of justice, there is also hope. As the night deepens and we near the end of our journey through darkness, there is one last story to tell, a story that lingers in the shadows long after the lights have faded. From the quiet streets of Japan comes the tragic tale of Junko Furuta, a young life stolen in a way so cruel it challenges the limits of understanding. Tonight, as you settle deeper into rest, breathe slowly and listen carefully. Let us remember her story with quiet reverence and close our night in reflection. In the suburban city of Misato, Japan, life moved at a steady, peaceful pace. Junko Furuta was a bright, cheerful 17-year-old high school student full of dreams and promise. One evening in November 1988, Junko's world changed forever. On her way home from school, she was kidnapped by a group of teenage boys. What happened next would become one of the most horrifying and tragic cases in modern Japanese history. Junko was taken to a house where she endured unimaginable torment for 44 long days. Her life was a nightmare filled with cruelty and despair. Her captors subjected her to physical and psychological abuse beyond comprehension. Despite her desperate pleas for help, no one came to her rescue. The world outside remained unaware of her suffering, trapped behind closed doors. Her disappearance sent shockwaves through the community, sparking frantic searches and mounting fear. Yet the truth of what she endured would only come to light months later, revealing a darkness too terrible to forget. For 44 agonizing days, Junko Furuta was held captive in a small, nondescript house, a place that became a prison of unspeakable horror. Her abductors, 4 teenage boys, inflicted relentless physical and psychological torture upon her. They subjected her to beatings, burns, and worse, stripping away every shred of her hope. The cruelty was not only vicious, but methodical, designed to break her spirit and silence her screams. Neighbors heard nothing. The walls concealed her suffering like a dark secret. Her captors moved with chilling coldness, taking pleasure in her pain and isolation. Throughout her captivity, Junko attempted to resist, to plead for mercy, and to survive against all odds. Yet the abuse continued unabated, her cries for help unheard by the outside world. Friends and families searched desperately, but the truth was buried behind locked doors. This nightmare would come to symbolize the darkest depths of human cruelty, a reminder of the vulnerability that exists even in the safest of places. It was only months later that the horror was finally brought to light. Junko's captors, growing careless, left clues that led the police to the grim truth. When investigators arrived at the house, they found scenes that no one could have imagined. The extent of Junko's torture was beyond horrific. She had been left barely alive, a fragile shadow of the vibrant girl she once was. Her injuries told a story of unimaginable suffering. Broken bones, burns, and scars that spoke of endless pain. The young girl who had once been full of life was now fighting a desperate battle just to survive. Junko Furuta passed away in the hospital, a victim of cruelty so deep it shook the nation. The news spread quickly, leaving communities across Japan in mourning and disbelief. Her story sparked outrage and sorrow, igniting discussions about justice, punishment, and the protection of the innocent. The trial of Junko Furuta's captors was a grim chapter marked by anger and sorrow. The 4 boys, barely adults, themselves faced the weight of a horrified nation's demand for justice. Despite the overwhelming evidence, the legal proceedings revealed troubling gaps in how the system handled juvenile offenders. Public outrage grew as many felt the punishments were too lenient for the severity of the crimes committed. The case sparked a national conversation in Japan about juvenile crime laws, victim protection, and society's responsibility to the vulnerable. It exposed uncomfortable truths about silence, bystander inaction, and the need for greater awareness. Junko's story became a somber symbol, a call to never forget the victims who suffer in the shadows. Her family's pain and bravery inspired many to push for changes to prevent such tragedies from happening again. As the night draws to its quiet close, we pause to remember Junko Furuta not just as a victim of cruelty, but as a young girl whose life deserved so much more. Her story, though filled with darkness, reminds us of the fragile light that each person carries inside. It calls us to listen more closely, to protect those who cannot protect themselves, and to stand against the shadows wherever they may lurk. In the stillness of this night, let us hold space for healing, for Junko, her family, and all whose voices were silenced too soon. May her memory inspire compassion and vigilance so that no other light fades in silence. As our journey through darkness comes to an end, we breathe out the shadows and welcome quiet calm. Tonight, we have walked alongside stories of pain, loss, and the depths of human cruelty, but also through resilience, hope, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. May these tales remind us to cherish every fragile light, to listen with empathy, and to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Now, as you drift deeper into rest, let the night cradle you gently, and may peace find its way into your dreams. Thank you for sharing this time, and may you wake renewed and safe. Good night.